Hi, everybody, and welcome to another event in the World Pride series from Dignity USA, Dignity Washington, Dignity Nova, Water, Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Rituals, and the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics. Tonight, we are very, very excited to be able to bring you Bryan Massingale, Father Bryan Massingale, to speak. Yes. For those who are not familiar with Bryan's bio, Bryan is a professor of theology and social ethics, and he holds the, I always have to get this, James and Nancy Buckman Chair in Applied Christian Ethics at Fordham University. He is a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and one of our leading theologians in terms of faith and faith-based ethics. He is a former president of the Society of Christian Ethics, a former convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium, and former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He has authored 2 books and has another one on the way, and more than 200 articles, book chapters, and book reviews. He is an internationally recognized scholar, teacher, and activist, a leader in social justice movements, and the only out Black Catholic priest in our country. Bryan is a proud member of the LGBTQ community, and he is a former consultant for the U.S. State Department, Strategic Religious Engagement Unit. I wonder how that's doing these days. It doesn't. In fact, the last State Department LGBTQ liaison didn't even know that such a thing had ever existed, so it was wiped entirely during the last Trump administration. We both served on that team. It was very important work, but lost to history. Bryan is a leading voice among Catholic thought leaders advocating for the full inclusion of LGBTQ persons in both society and the faith community. He's the co-founder of a global network of queer Catholic theologians of color and convened its inaugural gathering in the fall of 2021. His upcoming book is titled All of Us, a new agenda for Catholic theology from queer Catholics of color. We're very excited to have that come out. Bryan is also a great friend of Dignity USA. Just among some of the things that we've been able to do together, Bryan, along with Mary Hunt, were featured theologians when Dignity USA and the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics gathered together in Chicago in 2019 and had 3 out gay or queer Catholic theologians on a stage for the first time ever in history. That was great. Bryan keynoted our very first virtual gathering during the pandemic. He spoke at the 50th anniversary of Dignity San Francisco, and on and on and on. We're really happy and excited to have him here tonight. And I also have to tell you that earlier today, Bryan was with us when we presented the Risk Taker Justice Maker Award to Bishop Mary Ann Budde, an award that Bryan was presented just 2 years ago at this point. So it was the first time we've had some of our award winners ever together, a very moving moment. So Bryan, we're very much looking forward to your wisdom tonight. We thank you for being here, and please inspire us. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Ann. Good evening, everyone. Oh, God, you can tell the pigmentationally challenged group. Good evening, everyone. That's much better, much better, much better. It's really good to be here. It's an honor to be here, and it's good to be with dear friends. Thank you, Mary Ann, for the invitation, for all the work. Thank you, Darby, for all the logistical stuff and support. And I'm really pleased that Mary Hunt, a good friend for many years, is here as well. I'm really honored to be a part of Dignity USA's celebration of World Pride 2025. It's a recognition of Dignity USA's struggle for full recognition and a full inclusion, a radical inclusion of all of God's people. And this vision is not only admirable, but being here in this place is very significant for me personally. I attended my first ever Dignity Mass with Dignity Washington back in, oh yeah, you didn't know that, did you? No, put that in your history. Back in 1986, I was a graduate student at Catholic University. I was just a new priest, 3 years ordained, looking forward to being able to be in DC and explore what it meant to be like a gay priest. And I remember going to Dignity when the Mass was at Holy Trinity, and being so nervous and scared, like looking around and saying, is anyone going to recognize me? The second time I was at a Dignity Mass was in 1987. For the Second March on Washington, D.C. for gay rights. And Dignity sponsored a Mass that was held here in this very church because something had happened in between time. We had a Halloween letter and we were no longer welcomed at Holy Trinity. And so this church opened its space, opened its arms for Dignity to be here. And my second Mass was here during that event, and it was like something to die for. It was like 900 people in this space. I mean, I didn't know gay men could sing so, well, yes, I did, could sing so loudly and boisterously. But I remember being angry that this is a congregation that anyone should die for. And yet we were held here because our church did not give us welcome. The next time I attended a Dignity Mass was just before I left Washington, D.C. in 1988 to continue my doctoral studies in Rome. And I came for the normal Sunday night Mass and was held here. And the rector of the church at the time, a woman priest, began the Mass by welcoming us. She said that you're honored that I remember these words, you consecrate and hallow this space and make our congregation inclusive in deed as well as in word. And again, I welled up with tears and I said, I longed to hear a Catholic priest say that to us. And afterwards, as we were leaving church, she was greeting everyone who had come. And I looked at her and with great sadness, I said, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And she gave me this very generous hug. And she said, stay as long as you can with God's help, because where would your church be if everyone like you left? So it is a joy to be with you as we celebrate World Pride, but it's a special joy to be in this space because Dignity Washington has continued to consecrate and to hallow this space as we do tonight by our presence here. So we're gathered to celebrate World Pride 2025, but we also gather in really difficult, tough, precarious, and dangerous times. This World Pride is taking place under circumstances that few anticipated and no one wanted. Well, some folks wanted, but not most of us here. This event is not the one that folks desired, as many who wanted to be here were unable to enter the country, or feared entering the country, or feared being detained because of their views, because of their gender identities or gender expressions, or that of their spouses, their partners, or their families. The very reasons why we wanted to have a World Pride are also the very reasons why many can't be here. And many of us gather here tonight, and we are at uneasy at best, and fearful at worst, living in dread of the next executive order or the next pronouncement, or as I say more bluntly, the next edict. To not speak of these things would make World Pride not a celebration, but a fantasy, a dangerous delusion. And so I want to speak tonight, as you can see on the screen, about queer laments and courageous hope for such a time as this. If you'd advance to the next slide, please. The main message and takeaway I want to leave with you is this. Courage and hope are grounded in traditions, in communities who inhabit and inherit dangerous memories, that pregnant phrase by John Baptist Metz, dangerous memories of resistance and love. We cannot live courage and hope in isolation. We live them in communities. And so tonight as we gather, surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, and these are just 4 folks, Harvey Milk, Billy Porter, Sylvia Rivera, John McNeil. As we gather, we want to gather with those who have gone before us, and yet those who, because of our Catholic belief in the communion of saints, we also believe are still with us. And so tonight I'm going to give you the outline. We're going to speak about 3 laments, or 3 different groups of laments. Laments that we as queer folks share with all Americans. A second set are queer laments that are specific to us as queer Americans. And then thirdly, laments that we share as queer Catholic believers. And let me give a brief about terminology, because I know some people of a different generation bristle at the word queer. And that's okay if you do. I do too. I always say I'm gay, not queer. But I teach a lot of young people, and that's the word that they understand. So I'm going to be legible to them. And we're going to be intergenerational. They have to deal with me being gay. I have to deal with them being queer. So when I'm calling people queer, I'm not insulting anyone of a given age or maturity. I'm simply saying, use the terminology that a lot of our younger folks who are not only our future but our present also find themselves comfortable with. So now we've got that out of the way. So 3 different kinds of laments. Then I'm going to talk about dreams, because despite it all, we never lose our capacity to dream or imagine otherwise. And finally, then to reflect upon you of traditions of LGBTQ courage, that we can be inspired by the muscle memory of our forebears who lived in such a time as this and even worse, and worked and struggled with courage and with joy to make a better world for all of us. They leave us a precious legacy, a daunting challenge, and a tenacious hope. So let's begin by talking about lament. Next slide, please. Lament and lamentation. Next slide. Webster's app dictionary gives us this definition of lament. A verb, to mourn aloud, wail, to express sorrow, mourning, or regret demonstratively. As a noun, a crying out in grief or complaint or agony. The synonyms for a lament are to grieve, mourn, deplore, or groan in complaint. The German mystic and theologian Dorothy Soleil, in considering the challenge of piercing through the callous of indifference to the plight of those who suffer injustice, she writes, if people are not to remain unchanged in suffering, if they're not to remain blind or deaf to the pain of others, then one of the things they need is a language. And one such language present in our tradition is the language of lament. Lament is a profound response to suffering, one that stems from acknowledging its harsh reality. It entails being truthful, avoiding denial, and admitting the pain and the horror of suffering. We express our pain and lament by crying out, which allows us to grieve. Next slide, please. Lament appears to be a universal human phenomenon. People across culture, location, geography, and time have responded to suffering with expressions of sorrow and protest. I forget where exactly I read this, but I found out that anthropologists say that there are 3 kinds of songs that are common to human families across the world, and that is lullabies, wedding songs, and laments. Next slide, please. Laments are cries of anguish and outrage, groans of deep pain and grief, protests of righteous indignation over injustice, wails of mourning and sorrow in the face of unbearable suffering. Lamentation is a cry of utter protest at the state of the world and its brokenness. Laments name the pain present. They forthrightly acknowledge that life and relationships have gone terribly wrong. They are uncivil, strident, harsh, and heartrending. They are profound interruptions and calls to attention. Lamentation does not accept the status quo. Lament demands change. Next slide. Now, these emotionally laden protests in the face of suffering and injustice are a principal part of Israel's prayer and our faith heritage. Walter Brueggemann, who is the preeminent Old Testament scholar, he points out that lamentations and cries of personal and communal distress comprise fully 1/3 of the book of Psalms. But in our Catholic liturgy, we only read one of those Psalms once a year on Palm Sunday. My God, why have you forsaken me? We've lost the communal language of lament. Brueggemann concludes that the Old Testament laments were exercises of what he calls enormous chutzpah. That Israel, he says, did not hesitate to give full voice to its fear, anger, and dismay. The South African theologian Denise Ackerman, who you see her words up there on the screen, she echoes these sentiments after her rediscovery of this scriptural response to injustice. She writes, "These ancient people refused to settle for things as they were. They believed that God could, should, and indeed would do something to change unbearable circumstances. Their lament was candid, intense, robust, and unafraid. They complained, mourned, wept, chanted dirges, and cursed." I mean, God, I love that. They assailed the ears of God, next slide please, believing they could wring the hand of God, insisting that their petitions be taken so seriously, and that in so doing, they put God's self at risk. She concludes, "In the scriptural language of lament, I found a language that is honest, that does not shirk from naming the unnameable, that does not lie down in the face of suffering or walk away from God." Laments, as it says here, use pain, anguish, and anger and confusion in a passionate search for some answering comfort or sense of hope. And we have to learn to lament and to do it in community, whether or not it's on our behalf or as a way of speaking for others who are in far worse situations. So with that then, we have this rich tradition of lament. What do we as queer folks have to lament in our world, in our church, and society? Next slide, please. We need to lament over America's soul. our soul in the second Trump presidency. Next slide. What does the re-election of Donald Trump say about the soul of America? And note how I phrase that question. The deepest challenge we face is not about Donald Trump. The deepest challenge we face is what his re-election reveals about us as a country. Because tens of millions of folks, knowing everything they knew about him, voted for him. Next slide, please. From the beginning, Mr. Trump has made the centrality of white racial grievance and fear of the stranger central to his platform. Fear of the stranger. And later we'll specify who those strangers are, and they include most of us. This fear of the stranger becomes apparent when we look at the executive orders that he's proclaimed, promulgated thus far. And I note in parentheses, these are not acts of Congress. These are solely edicts of presidential decree. And that's what we're living in now. Next slide. We see this in the mass furlough of federal DEI employees and the shuttering of federal DEI offices, even in the military. His appointees are on record as saying the goal is to utterly destroy DEI and then to, quote, salt the earth, unquote, apparently to ensure that they never return. Next slide. But this is not simply about hostility to a controversial practice. What we are witnessing is the wholesale dismantling of the federal civil rights infrastructure. Whether this is the prohibition of the Department of Justice's enforcement of police consent decrees, the stoppage of all activity of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the repeal of President Johnson's 1965 executive order mandating that federal contractors ensure some effort toward a racially and gender diverse workforce. This is the undoing of federal policy which has guided our country for over 60 years. And this is not small black and Latino Americans, but this is the dismantling of mechanisms for gender equity as well. Next slide. We're also seeing the resumption of mass immigration raids, detentions, and deportations, even to the point of not respecting previously sensitive, I would argue, sacred areas such as churches, houses of worship, schools, and hospitals and medical offices. Next. We also see this in the declaration that the United States will recognize only two genders established at conception, quote unquote, leading to the prohibition of trans persons from serving in the military, the cessation of recognizing trans or non-cisgender identities in U.S. passports or other official documents. This amounts to the erasure of trans and non-binary persons from our public life. And later we'll see it's not just about trans or non-binary persons, but it's about all of us. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Next slide, please. The prohibition of U.S. funding for global HIV prevention and treatment. The single most effective policy for eradicating and controlling the spread of this disease around the world has now been stopped. The withdrawal of the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords and the World Health Organization, and the eradication of the USAID and life-saving food and medical care for millions around the world. Next slide, please. The suspension of communications and conference support for federal health agencies such as the FDA and the CDC. These communications from these agencies must now be cleared to make sure their messages support President Trump's priorities and messages. Next slide, please. The use of trade and tariffs as instruments of foreign policy enforcement, also known as extortion. Next slide, please. Also, the retaliation against those who have opposed or investigated his previous administration, the firing of U.S. attorneys who investigated his conduct around handling classified documents, and his actions around January 6th, the withdrawing of Secret Service protection from former State Department Secretary Mike Pompeo, Dr. Fauci, John Bolton, The not so subtle message is that even white cisgender men are not safe from retaliation if they cross or defy his conduct or messaging. Next slide. But again, the issue is not simply Donald Trump. Rather, the question is, what does his election and what do his actions reveal about the soul of America? He's tapped into deep American fears, especially a fear of the stranger. The resentments and anxieties over a changing America are so deep that tens of millions of people were willing to overlook or disregard his criminal convictions, his manifold legal charges, his denigration and contempt for the judicial system, his adjudicated abuse of women, the litany of gender and racial insults that have gotten him fired from most corporations, his refusal to accept his 2020 election loss, his dangerous efforts to overturn the will of the voters, as well as the cruelty of separating children from their parents in the name of national security. The reality is that none of this was disqualifying for tens of millions of Americans. Instead, next slide, his denigration of immigrants as vermin, his hostility toward judges, prosecutors, and journalists who disagree with him, his praise of his beautiful white skin, quote unquote, these are what many found attractive. He talks the way I do. He says what I want to say. He says out loud what I'm thinking. He puts into words what I feel. Mr. Trump expresses the part of the American soul that wants everyone to think like us, act like us, pray like us, think like us, love like us, look like us. That is, if the us are white conservative Christians, especially white conservative Christian men. And we need to dwell on this. Just next slide, please. We need to go deeper and see what is the connecting thread and the priority of what we need to lament. Next slide. That what we see running through everything, this whole litany of stuff I talked about, is a denigration of those deemed different from white, straight Christian men. We see this, next slide, in the mandate to protect Christianity to the exclusion of any mention of Islam, Judaism, or any of the other major world religions that were practiced here in America. We see this, next slide, in the severe gender imbalance in presidential appointments. There's a website where you can actually track the gender of the presidential appointees, and as of yesterday, it's about more than 2 to 1. 71% men, only 28% women. Next slide, please. We see this in the banning of the celebration of certain months, Black History Month, Hispanic History Month, Women's History Month, even Pride Month. I'm surprised that there are even pride flags allowed to fly in this city. They're not saying that there's a throwaway line. Next slide, please. The banning of resources for any kind of social minority students, even tutoring, special dorms, senior recognitions, and next slide, the suspension of the efforts to overturn birthright citizenship. Why is this important? Because if we don't have a constitutionally protected right of citizenship, who determines who's a citizen? He does. The next slide tells us everything. The connecting thread is an effort, nothing less than a systemic effort to erase certain identities, certain groups from our public life. The acting Undersecretary of State, a very interesting man up there, Darren Beattie, who will give you a famous footnote in someone's dissertation someday because he hasn't said anything really important, except he did say this. Next slide. Competent white men must be in charge if we want things to work. At least he's being really blunt about it. Competent white men must be in charge if we want things to work. Next slide. But then he says, unfortunately, our entire national ideology is predicated on coddling the feeling of women and minorities and demoralizing competent white men. Next slide. Which is why DEI must be dismantled and have the earth salted beneath it. Next slide. What we're seeing here is the full flowering of an ideology of white Christian nationalism in our country. Next slide. This is not about meritocracy. Next slide. It's not merely about racism. There's too many people think racism is just bad people doing bad things. Next slide. It's about enshrining America as a privileged place for white, straight, male comfort and dominance. That's what all of this is about. But, next slide. It's based on the assumption that God has ordained white men to rule. That, quote, next slide, white male supremacy is the will of God. That is the governing ideology. That is the only religion that this government recognizes and is willing to protect. And so, next slide. We lament our divided soul. We grieve because we're torn between two Americas. One where we celebrate our changing faces, the diversity of God's creation, and the other an America driven by fear and vengeance and cruelty, symbolized at Charlottesville, when young white men walked through the streets of an American city carrying lanterns and torches, chanting, "You will not replace us." We mourn and we grieve. But this leads to a second set of laments. Next slide. Those that are specific or unique for LGBTQ persons. It flows from what we're going to see, but we need to talk about specifically queer stuff now. Next slide. The Human Rights Campaign in 2023 made an unprecedented move where it declared that there is a state of emergency in America for LGBT queer people. That we are living at a time when the black queer New York Times columnist Charles Blow has said it's a state of emergency in the United States. Next slide. In a growing number of places, there are laws that seek to erase our existence. Trans people are being refused life-saving, gender-affirming medical care. Books that speak of LGBTQ lives and history are being banned from school libraries. Teachers who say the words gay, lesbian, or queer are being fired in our public schools. Drag shows and story hours are being prohibited. States are passing laws that prohibit discussion of LGBTQ topics in schools and even workplaces. In a growing number of schools, teaching about Stonewall is simply prohibited. And if you see there that Stonewall is being revised, or has been revised, the National Park Service revised Stonewall to remove any reference to T or Q in the history of Stonewall. So Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson have been edited out of our history. No T, no Q. And in fact, just before we came today, breaking news, the Secretary of Defense has ordered the U.S. Navy to strip Harvey Milk's name from the USS Harvey Milk. It needs to be taken away even amid Pride Month. That's not accidental, folks. Also, the ship's name, Thurgood Marshall and Harriet Tubman, must also be renamed. And the rationale given is that we must re-establish the warrior culture, because obviously Harvey Milk can't be a warrior. We'll come back to that in just a moment. This is not an overstatement. There are serious efforts underway to create a world in which we do not exist. Next slide. This is not an overstatement. This is mainstream political discourse. In March of 2023, the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is the national meeting of right-wing activists, politicians, and thought leaders, that is the core and base of the Republican Party, a speaker inspired cheers when he called for the eradication of transgenderism. Michael Knowles, who is the editor of the Daily Wire, declared, if transgenderism is false, as it is, if men really can't become women as they cannot, then it is false for everyone. There can be no middle way in dealing with transgenderism. It is all or nothing. It must be eradicated from public life, close quote. Now, people criticized his views and said, this sounds like genocide. And he denied his stance was genocidal. In fact, he doubled down on it because he said it can't be genocidal because, quote, trans people don't exist in the first place, unquote. Quoting him, it's not a legitimate category of being. You see, I love that, I put up there all the bad news. We're laboring under a delusion, and so we need to correct that delusion. So we're seeing here the effort to rewrite history, to strip us of our memory. But this is really important, and this is key because you have to understand that when they take away your memory, they take away your identity. This is really key. When they take away your memory, they take away your identity. And if we can get this slide up, or have we lost the feed? Ah, there we go, good. You got it. I really wanted you guys to see this one. Yeah, my hero and yours. The deepest danger is that when you lose your identity, they will create one for us. And this is the most insidious danger behind J.D. Vance's assertion that normal gay guys support him and the president. Think about that. Normal gay guys. Who defines who's normal? And so I really want to think about this, and I think that what he wants to do is create something that looks like this. Next slide. He wants to create something where a triangle, pyramid, where white cishet men, well, you get that back, there you go, white cishet men are at top, but then in the middle there are the normal gay guys, what I call them the honorary straight bros. The honorary straight bros. Those are the people who are not only straight acting. Remember that from Grindr and everything like that? We want you saying, what, you read Grindr? My students tell me. Anyway, just making sure you're still with me. Okay. They only want people not only to be straight acting, they want people who are straight thinking. The honorary straight bros. But note who's at the bottom of the pyramid, who's subject to systemic public erasure. There are no L's. There are no T's. There are no Q's. There are no POCs. There are no non-masculine men. That's why Harvey Milk can't be an exemplar of a warrior culture. When you lose your identity, others will impose one upon us. That's the real danger of this moment. The normal gay guys, the honorary straight bros. But the honorary straight bros are deluding themselves because what they give you, they can take away. And then we also have to deal with the complicity of religious leaders, including Catholic ones. We see this in policies over trans students and teachers in our schools and ministries, and even from the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, who earlier this year issued a statement of concern over the president's immigration policies, but prefaced it with a statement of praise for his support of recognizing only two genders given by God at birth. And this leads to specifically Catholic queer laments. We'll rejoin the PowerPoint in process. But I'm going to do this in 2 points. The first is that we've just recently, and we still are, mourning the loss of Pope Francis. And Pope Francis, without doubt, you can go to the next slide. Enter the next slide. Oops. And the next one. There we go, Pope Francis. There's no doubt that Pope Francis had a groundbreaking welcome of LGBTQ persons, beginning with, next slide, in 2013 with his now famous, if someone is gay and sincere and searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? Then in 2023, 10 years later, he called for, quote, next slide, the decriminalization of adult consensual same-sex activities, saying being homosexual isn't a crime. Next slide. He stated that gays, lesbians, and trans persons can be baptismal godparents, sacramental sponsors. That's significant because it means that we can now be models of holiness. Next slide. Pope Francis has also affirmed long-suffering pioneers in LGBTQ ministries in the United States, Brazil, and Italy. These ministries had been officially ostracized and vilified. And we have Sister Janine Gramick here, who has been rehabilitated under Pope Francis. I know, Janine, this is your hero, but just wait, there's a lament coming up, Janine, okay? Next slide. He's also met with LGBTQ advocates for civil equality, and specifically, next slide, criticized Uganda's harshly punitive anti-homosexuality act of 2023. Next slide. He's delivered messages, pastoral welcome messages to LGBTQ congresses. Next slide. And his famous phrase, everyone is welcome. Todos, todos, todos. Next slide. Next. Also under Pope Francis, we have an unprecedented recognition of the goodness and values present in committed same-sex relationships. Next slide. Even in 2021, the previous statement that said we couldn't bless same-sex marriages or same-sex relationships, there was a note that said that they do have positive elements that should be valued and supported. Next slide. And then Fiducia Supplicans in 2023 goes further, stating that blessing same-sex unions is a recognition and celebration of all that is good and true and humanly valid in these relationships. Next slide. And so the act of blessing recognizes, deepens, and strengthens the grace that's already present. Beautiful. Next slide. But. There are significant reservations. We have to still lament and grieve and mourn that we are still living in a heteronormative church. An aura of stigma and inferiority surrounds the discussion of same-sex relationships. The act of blessing same-sex couples is still hedged with reservations, admonitions, warnings, and concerns. Look at the list there. Even in blessing, it can't take place in a liturgical rite. I can't wear vestments. They should not be connected with the rite of marriage. You can't use any vesture or clothing that's proper to marriage. Bishop conferences can't develop an official rite. They should only be spontaneous, not publicly advertised. So we have drive-by blessings, okay, basically. Next slide. Why? Because the Catholic Church has not overcome the stigma attached to same-sex relationships, because relationships are still judged as occasions of intrinsically evil moral acts, and we're still considered objectively disordered in our sexuality. These teachings have not changed, and they limit the extent to which the Catholic Church can embrace and welcome same-sex relationships. One way to understand this, next slide, is that Pope Francis desired to extend a welcome and embrace of LGBTQ persons and same-sex relationships as far as he can, while still maintaining a heteronormative understanding of human sexuality. Now, I use that word heteronormative, so let's break it apart for folks and make sure we're all on the same page. Next slide. Basically, the heteronormative paradigm says that heterosexual relationships are the best expression of God's intent. That's where we get heteronormativity. Next slide. But there is this generous recognition, generous, I'm being facetious here, a life of depression, loneliness, isolation, and self-estrangement is contrary to human well-being and flourishing. What do you do? Next slide. You compromise. This is what got poor Charlie Curran in trouble. Stable, committed same-sex relationships are imperfect, lacking, deficient, but not sinful. Don't you feel affirmed already? This is pastoral accommodation. Next slide. They are the least wrong alternative, the lesser evil, the best possible alternative for those who can't live up to the moral norm or rule. I love this. When I was a seminarian, I did a whole paper on the theology of compromise, and I thought at the time, this is like, 1982, wow, the church is making room for me. Because that's where we were then. But that's where we still are. Next slide. There's a heteronormative logic here. Next slide. Male, female, binary, heterosexual relationships open to procreation are the God-given norm. Heteronormativity is God-ordained. Next slide. But we can create room to accommodate those who cannot live up to the ideal, much as we create accommodations for those who live with disabilities. I'm using that word deliberately, not because of the stigma attached to it, because that is indeed the mentality that's here. Next slide. But we cannot act as if heteronormativity isn't the norm. That's a direct quote from Fiducia Supplicans. Next slide. So Pope Francis went as far as he could to extend welcome within this framework. Now, is that an advance over where we were? Objectively, yes. Is it something to celebrate without condition? Not for me. But then, what do we do with Pope Leo? Next slide. Now, I'm going to give him some slack because he's only been in the job less than a month, okay? But I do want to raise a concern, and that is his constant call for unity in the church, a concern that I have. Next slide. You see, there have been theologians who have justified Pope Francis's mixed messages by saying that these are necessary to preserve the unity of the church, that we want to avoid a schism. We don't want to split the church as what happened to the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the Anglicans, the Methodists, the Presbyterians. Next slide. We want to keep us all together. Next slide. And so because of that, then, we need to accommodate these mixed messages. Is the price of keeping the church together. Next slide. But this raises the question, lots of questions, but unity at what price? And who pays the price? Next slide. What about the price of the psychological damage that is given to the LGBTQ community as they continually endure and internalize mixed messages while we patiently wait for the church to recognize the presence of God in our expressions of sexual love? Mixed messages such as, we love you, but we accept you, but you're welcome, but I teach 18 to 22-year-olds. That kind of mixed messaging is not heard as celebration. It's not heard as celebration. So yes, there's a Catholic desire to keep the church together, but who pays the price? And at what cost? Next slide. So yes, there's a Catholic desire to avoid the schisms, but we have to lament and ask ourselves some haunting questions. Next. At what price do we preserve unity? And note unity is in quotation marks. What do we mean by unity? There's an article coming out in the fall where I talk about that. You're getting the highlights right now. Next slide. Who is being asked to pay the price and shoulder the burden of unity while we wait for a consensus to appear? Next. Is it right to ask those who are already laden with stigma and shame to bear the burden of being patient while others struggle to recognize what God is doing already with and among us? And finally, next slide. Is this the kind of unity Christ would want for Christ's church? A Christ who himself carried the lost and abandoned, identified with the least and the ostracized, celebrated table fellowship in the name of God with social outcasts and religiously marginal. I know that we're gathered to celebrate World Pride, but we also need to be honest about where we are as a country, as queer people in this country, as queer people in our church. We have to have the courage to wail, to grieve, to mourn, and to lament. Next slide. And still we dream. We dream. I have long been taken with the power of the human imagination, especially in the imagination among the stigmatized, disdained, and I'm inspired by how, despite all that we have been through, we still dream of new worlds. We persist in the hope that reality not only should, but will be other than what it is. Let me make this personal with a story. Next slide. One of my prized possessions is a huge gold leaf black leather bound dictionary that my grandmother gave me for my 8th grade graduation. Soon it'll pop up. The New Webster Encyclopedic Dictionary of the English Language. It contained over 973 pages of definitions, with an additional 500 pages of reference material, including how to write a letter to the President of the United States, well before Obama. My grandmother was constantly challenged, why would you give a gift like that to a 14-year-old boy living in Milwaukee's inner city? And her response was, because someday he may need it. Because someday he may need it. Someday. Next slide. That's it. It's the dictionary. I love it. Still keep it. My grandmother was not delusional. She did not live in denial of reality, in denial of the fact that our neighborhood store was called derisively by my siblings and I, Rats and Roaches Incorporated. Yeah, it was. Her gift was a vision, an act of hope. It was a dream, a hope, a reminder that the neighborhood, with its drugs and violence and rodent-infested store and its overpriced goods, that did not set the limits of who I was or the limits of my possibility. Her gift was a conjuring of imagination. My grandmother dreamed. And dreamed while being black. Next slide. World Pride is a time to remember faith-filled activism rooted in justice. The Black historian Robin D. Kelly is correct when he observes that the catalyst for political engagement has never been misery, poverty, or oppression, but the promise of constructing a new world. And we see here Ugandans protesting anti-gay legislation in 2023. Dreams are catalysts for risk-taking. It's envisioning somewhere in advance of nowhere. It's envisioning a world that does not yet exist but must someday come to be. Next slide. Imagination and dreaming are born out of dissatisfaction with the status quo. Imagination and dreaming express subversive agency. Both terms are important. Social queer imagination has an inherent Ooh. Didn't have a PowerPoint for the Sermon on the Mount, so we can make this work. Let's see. We're good? Hello? Oh, we're back. Well, we're back. Good. Subversive agency. By imagining alternatives to the familiar, communities of the stigmatized expose and exceed the limits that are imposed upon us. We occupy more space than we've been allotted. That's what imagination does. Now, one of the three Black queer founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza, she conveys the subversive agency of imagination when she writes, and this is a beautiful quote, "When we create spaces that allow us to be our full selves, unapologetically, we are engaging in acts of resistance and liberation. We defiantly take up more space than we are given. We choose to live in the world that does not yet exist, but one day will surely come." I think of this space. It's an act of subversive agency and imagination. I look at you, Mary, and water. I mean, it's an act of subversive agency, creating a world that does not yet exist. This is what dignity does every time you gather in all of the different chapters. This is what, New Ways Ministry does. When you have that blog that comes out every morning, I read faithfully every morning. We are taking up more space than we've been given. We are choosing to live in a world that does not yet exist. We are engaging in acts of resistance and liberation. One of the most essential acts of any liberation movement is to abolish our imaginative slavery. This is what I think is the greatest danger what's happening now, is that it's not just the edicts and the pronouncements, but they're trying to put chains around our imaginations and our ability to imagine or dream that it could be otherwise. We are creating spaces, fugitive spaces. But dreams and dreaming are not a denial of reality. Dreaming is not a fantasy. It's not escape. My grandmother was not delusional. There are many in church and society who don't understand us, who fear us, who will seek to erase us and censor us, to even eradicate us, and still we dream. Still we dream. We dream with the Black gay actor and activist Billy Porter, who refused to lie that he was unworthy. We dream inspired by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, trans persons of color, gender-bending activists at Stonewall. We dream with the witness of John McNeil. At lunch today, we heard about how you discovered John McNeil and found his book in a used bookstore, and yes, those trailblazing pioneers who can still inspire our memories, who was dismissed from the Jesuits because of his ministry, and yet continued, inspired by the Ignatian spirituality that formed him, even as the Jesuits could not recognize him as one of their own. Our laments and our protests are fueled by dreams, by a quest for that world where we can breathe free. So this leads to the final part of my talk, and it's too bad the slides aren't here because they're really beautiful, but when they come back, we'll come back. And that is, in light of this, how then do we live courageous memory? And we live courageous memory, remember, we don't live in isolation. Courage and hope are sustained by communities of memory, communities of resistance and love. And we are inheritors of courageous memory. I want to lift up 5 of those memories that can inspire us as we live today. If you fly Delta this month, in the movies, they have the Pride selection. And so I've made a couple of cross-country trips. One of the options is the movie Milk. I remember watching it when it first came out, and so we're rewatching it now years later. And it's amazing, and I think we have to watch it and lift it up because Harvey Milk and that story remind us that the San Francisco of today is not the way San Francisco always was. San Francisco back in the day was a time when there was police violence against the gay community. It was a time where opening a business and having it being queer-owned was something that could be having a rock thrown through your window, being reported to the police and have it shut down. There were measures underway, ballot initiatives to kick lesbian and gay teachers out of classrooms. In the midst of this, Milk and the community did the unthinkable, what many thought was the impossible. They elected one of the first openly gay public leaders in the country. That is a story that we need to lift up and be inspired by that courageous memory. Another option on the Delta Pride Month menu is the movie Paris is Burning. I remember watching that when I'm getting old now. I remember watching when it first came out. I watched it again, and it's truly amazing. I mean, I watched it, and this time as I watched it, I thought, Drag Race would not exist if it weren't for Paris is Burning. And I love Drag Race. I was watching it in San Francisco at an establishment, also known as a bar. And one of my companions said to me, "This is like our Super Bowl." I'm like, okay, fine. Anyway, the urban ball culture, the underground network of Black and Latino, gay and trans kids who were disowned by their families and by the wider white gay community, that they created families of love and nurture. And not only that, they created culture. Words like slay, sashay, gagged, I'm so gagged. Realness. Those weren't invented by RuPaul. They were invented by these ghetto gay and trans kids and they also created joy and lived joy. Watching that movie, I remembered how jealous I was because I could never Vogue. And these kids, many of them who didn't know where they'd be sleeping that night or where their next meal would come from, they yet created a culture of joy. So much of who we are today is because of what they dreamed and had the courage to create then. That's a courageous memory we can hold on to for such a time as this. Another memory I want to lift up is the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We're living in a time of government indifference and callous neglect, but this is not the first time. During the 1980s, President Reagan would never mention the word AIDS in public. Many of us can remember visiting loved ones in hospitals and sometimes having to carry the tray in the room because the medical staff didn't have the courage or wouldn't want to enter in to feed the patient that was inside. And we also had an official church that basically ostracized condoms. And some in the religious community said that HIV/AIDS was a punishment for sin. Despite that, we created care networks. We cared for our own. We single-handedly changed our sexual practices and taught each other what it meant to be with each other in safer ways that could still be loving. We taught our own history. The first queer books on history came out during that terrible time. We organized marches and protests, and I had this beautiful slide of the ACT UP protest. I love it at St. Patrick's Cathedral. We loved each other. We mourned our dead. We comforted loved ones. And we created culture and beauty. And it's too bad I can't show you the slide of that magnificent AIDS quilt that covered the National Mall, which to this day is the largest piece of public art created in the world. And we did all that despite the indifference and the hostility of our government and our church. That's a courageous memory that we can hold on to. And we talk about Catholic activism. Despite our church, we have hung in there with it. Despite the censure of theologians, and I remember coming of age where you had to always look over your shoulder if you said the wrong thing, who was going to report you. And despite being evicted from churches, we have stayed. Despite people being fired from our positions, we've stayed. And Dignity, you know that story. That's why we gather here tonight, but we've stayed. That is a courageous memory of hope that we can hold on to. And the final courageous memory I want to lift up is not a memory at all, it's current life. And it's too bad I can't show you this one because it's really beautiful. It's the activism that is going on the continent of Africa. I was privileged to visit South Africa the month of last September. I went to explore how Pope Francis's call to decriminalize homosexuality is being received in the African continent. And so I went to South Africa, which is the only safe place you can really do this kind of work and this kind of research. And while I was there, a Zimbabwean trans man who opened up an asylum shelter for African refugees from across the continent. It's called the Fruit Loop. And so he invited me to come and visit the Fruit Loop, and I said, sure, I'd be happy to. And so Tamar's invited me, and so I met with a group of 17 trans and gay and lesbian, queer young people. The oldest was maybe 23, because you have to be pretty young if you're going to make the dangerous journey from Ghana, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Zambia, cross all those borders, get all the way down to South Africa, the only place on the continent where it's constitutionally protected to be gay and lesbian and trans. And so I went there, I met them for lunch. As we're eating our meal, they said, "Can we ask you some questions?" I said, "Sure." The first question: can you give us an exegesis of the Sodom and Gomorrah and Leviticus? Well, these are the passages that are used to beat them up. The second question: is there anything in the Bible that says that God loves us as we are? The third question: do you struggle with your faith? Do you ever think that they are right about us? I asked them, am I the first priest or minister that's ever visited with you? And they said, yes. And I said, thank you for inviting me into your house. One of the women present, who identifies as lesbian, spoke of her experience of corrective rape, where you're being changed by having sex with a man. She spoke of the violence and the horror of that experience, but she concluded by saying, that experience fuels me and what I do. I am doing what I do for the younger me's out there. I don't want them to ever have the experience that I have. That experience compels me to continue doing this work. And I left there in awe. Because even though many of us have suffered the difficulties of doing this work, these people are doing this work under unimaginable terror. And I lift them up because that's an example of courageous hope that can sustain us as we live in such a time as this. This is not a time that any of us would have chosen to live in. This is not a time that any of us would have wanted. But deep down, I have to believe that we are meant to be here for such a time as this. It's no accident that we are here. We are here for such a time as this. So I was going to end with this wonderful slide of a quotation from Catherine of Siena that I discovered at the Dignity San Francisco 50th Jubilee, where St. Catherine of Siena said, "Be what God meant you to be, and you will set the world on fire." Our world needs a few flamers right now. So let's be whom God wants us to be, inspired by the generations of courageous queer people who've gone before. Let us grieve, let's mourn, let's protest, but let's continue to be inspired by the legacy of courage and courageous hope. Let us be what God has made us to be. And let's set this world and this church on fire. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, it's a joy being with you. Thank you. So I'll take questions, yeah, but I've got some rifles.
I didn't see jobs.
I was eating one of these in the airport, and I said, "Do they have a CBD dispensary around here?" I said, "No."
Thank you. If there are folks who would want to engage Bryan with some responses to that very sweeping, very challenging, very encouraging, and like dream us into a new reality that is not this one, even as we are living this one. Please, anyone like to say, is there another mic, or are we going to just use this? Okay, there's another mic being brought up. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question, make a comment? Huh? Yep. Yeah, Jason, please.
Is this on now? Yeah.
Okay.
By the way, this isn't working, but the slides are all on the recording. They are.
Okay.
Cool. All right.
Okay.
If they're on Facebook, they will be on
Okay.
YouTube, so you can see.
Okay. That's great. So we will make sure that you all get the link to this so you can see the slides and share the information. Yeah, I said to Bryan earlier today, you do the most magnificent slides for all of his talks. So thank you. Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
So, as a public theologian, I guess I'm curious as to how we can engage this moment, harnessing citizen journalism and theological reflection as a way of speaking out against injustice, but also giving a sacred voice to what we're facing.
I think that's one of the struggles we have right now, is because one of my fears is that we're so segmented in our media approach, whatever. So how do we get a wider conversation going that isn't already talking to the converted or whatever? Now, one, I think that's important to talk to the converted, because we continually need to have our own hope lifted up. Because I think one of the dangers of this moment is that we all think that we're isolated, and we get really depressed, despairing. But yeah, I think that one of the things we need to do is lifting up blogs and things like that. But right now, one of the things that's concerning to me is that folks that have platforms are running scared of using their platforms. I'm thinking of one particular Catholic review that may or may not be run by a Jesuit publication, but that has a pretty wide reach, but is pretty, put it charitably, cautious about taking on the current reality with the forcefulness that it needs to be done. And so I think one of the things we need to do is not only look at what's existing, but in each of these instances, where, especially during the HIV crisis, during the at Harvey Milk, during the ball culture, they created new media for the moment. And so maybe I think one of the things we need to look at is how can we use our imaginations to create new forms of citizen journalism, to really get the message out there that needs to be, messages of encouragement, messages of resistance, messages of challenge. Now, admittedly, I'm old school, so I'm not really good at thinking about that outside the box. That's not my forte, but I really do think that this moment is calling for that kind of inventiveness and creativity, to think of new forms of communication. One of the things that really impressed me about the Milk movie and his experience was that they did all of this by using old-fashioned phone trees. I mean, they didn't have, what we text chains or things like that. You had to call one person, they called another person, they called. I mean, and I sometimes challenge my students. I said, imagine what they could do if they had social media. And I'm just thinking that It's an invitation to all of us to be really creative about that, because I think that's exactly what we need to do in this moment. To think of creative ways to sustain hope and sustain resistance. So thank you.
Does a pastoral approach lead to a change in dogma? Pope Francis used a pastoral approach, was afraid to split the church, hoping that dogma would change. But is that a dream or is that a possibility?
I think there's a difference between dream and delusion. So let me explain that. Every Christian body that has wrestled with the issue of inclusion and affirmation of the LGBTQ community, or even with, more adequate ways and approaches and understandings of human sexuality, none of them have escaped schism and division. The Anglicans haven't, the Lutherans haven't, the Presbyterians haven't, the Methodists haven't. Why do we think that the Catholic Church is going to be the major exception to the rule? I think that Pope Francis optimistically has laid the groundwork for change and development. But my question is, how long will we have to wait for that? I think that this is a necessary step. In my work on Fiducia Supplicans, I said it's a giant baby step. Whereas Pope Francis would say the Church's catechesis on sexuality is still in diapers. That's what he said. But somewhere, somehow, we have to bite the bullet on this. Because what's at stake here are the lives and dignity of human persons. And we cannot play around with that. People are dying, people are being killed because of our dogmatic belief. Now, I think that he's laid the groundwork for this, for a change. But I think that in the name of justice and in the name of the God we believe in, that sooner or later, and sooner better than later, we're going to have a change of dogma. And if we don't have a change in doctrine, then I think it's up to the sensus fidelium of the church. And I think the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful, is changing. And ultimately, what the church does usually is belatedly recognize what people have already believed in, and makes it plain. But I think eventually it's going to have to change. It can't go on the way it is. Now, the good news is that every church that has moved has lived in this messy in-between period where we are. So in other words, we're replicating the same dynamics that they had. But I am not optimistic that we're going to get there without a schism. But I don't think it's going to be a major one. Because in every denomination that has had to endure a schism, it has not been the majority that has, split. It's a minority that has split. And I think sometimes we have to have a gracious parting of the ways and say, in the name of God, this is what we believe, and this is where we have to go. Now, I know Catholics have an allergy to that word schism, but I think that, I can't imagine Jesus being proud of a church that has a teaching that leads to the murder of people. I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic. As I tell my students, bad theology kills. And I think we have to come to terms with that. I know in this diocese, Cardinal Gregory, one of the last things he did on the way out the door was he issued an apology. I think that's good. But I think the church really does have to come to grips with the fact that people have died and are dying. when I was in Africa, the African LGBTQ activists, they told me their major fear was that the church in Africa, churches in Africa, would hold the rest of the church hostage and say, if you change, then we'll leave. And they said, but that is playing with our lives. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, pastoral accommodations are helpful to a point. We can't stop there. We can't live there. We can't stay there.
Okay. First, I'd like to say thank you. I appreciated what you said in the beginning about what we do here is radical, and I mean we do that every Sunday, and I mean because I am one of those people who had that religious trauma when I was a teenager, and when I came here, this was a place where I could begin to heal and have community and develop the courage that you were talking about. But, I found most of, it's not an insult, but I found your litany of things numbing, to be quite honest about it. So what, and the last answer to your last question was actually the most hopeful thing for me that I've heard. If we just need to move on. But what do you think in all of that list of things going on, what do you find the one thing that gives you the most passion to keep you going?
I don't know if that's anything I listed in terms of the laments that keep me going. There's so many things going through my mind, but let me start with what you just said, because it triggered something that happened recently. You said that what you do here every Sunday is radical, but yet it's ordinary, right? But it's radical. And I had this experience I was in Oakland this weekend preaching at a Pride Mass. And afterwards, 3 women approached me after Mass, and they identified themselves as being teachers in Catholic schools. And they said that they teach in high schools, and that in their Catholic social teaching class, they have the students do an assignment, a report on a social justice figure, and that I'm one of the options. Oh, okay, fine. How does that work? And this one person said, you will never know the lifeline you are to my queer students. And I'm still processing that. I'm still because I think what I'm doing is just ordinary. I mean, I'm just doing me. This is what I do, this is what I think. And yet, just doing what we do can be very radical and life-giving in ways that we will never know. And that's what keeps me going. The belief that this is making a difference. No matter what is going on out there, that not waiting for permission to come out publicly. No one ever gave me permission to do that. No one would give me permission to do that. But it's not just me doing it by myself, but me doing it in community and surrounded by folks. People like Mary Hunt, who, when we were in Arcus, remember way back in the day, and I remember I think when we met each other, I don't think you liked me very much, because I was much more pious than I am now, or more careful, I would say. And I think I'm the person I am today because of people like Mary, and because of people like you, Mary Ann. And so what gives me hope is that what keeps me going is that I can now do that for others. And this is why dignity, it's important that you stay in existence. This is why New Ways Ministry, it's important to keep going. This is why, Jeremiah, you got to keep doing what you're doing. Because my students read your stuff. Why? Because I make them, they get extra credit for it. So, but it's important because you don't know, we don't know who we're touching, who we're sustaining. And that's the way in which we keep hope alive. So in all of that, I'm sorry that was so numbing, but not really, because we've got to look at this so we're not living in delusion and fantasy. This is not being heroic, but it is calling for a certain kind of courage because there is a risk in doing what we're doing. There is a risk in this. But that's what keeps me going. So thank you for the question. Sure. I mean, let's. This is the best part.
This is a question on sexual ethics and the church's sexual teaching, and we started it way back in the 70s. We have all the sexual ethics that we'd like to now see it on the the official level. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do we do that? Or what do we do to see that come about? I mean, some bishops and cardinals have said, oh, the church's teaching has to change. But what do we do to push it?
That's good. And thank you, Janine. Janine and I met way back when in Milwaukee when you came, and you and Bob Nugent, were doing your, traveling show or whatever. I remember you asking me, did you say anything that was against church teaching? And I said, you're far more cautious and more careful and respectful than I would be. But anyway, one of the things that Pope Francis did do, and I think was a game changer, was that he told the bishops that they could speak their minds. Because remember, under John Paul II and Benedict, bishops were not allowed to depart from the company line. And so if you took on one bishop, you took them all on because they all sang from the same page and they sang from the same hymnal. What Pope Francis did was that he said he had this culture, what he called parousia, the Greek word meaning bold speech, courageous speech. And what we discovered under Pope Francis, we discovered three things that are really important. The first, we found that the official teaching of the church no longer reflects a consensus of the magisterium. Now, let me be clear. I'm using the word consensus in a very technical word. Consensus means 2/3. And at each synod, the official position has never garnered the support of 2/3 of the world's bishops. That's important. The second thing we discovered is that many bishops want a different approach to sexual ethics. That they see that the current teaching isn't adequate, and so the need for a different sexual ethics is the current consensus. The third thing we discovered is that there is no consensus about what the new approach should be. That's where it breaks down. The consensus is that something needs to change. There's no consensus about what that change should look like. Now, you're right. We've had the elements of a new sexual ethics for a long time now. I'm thinking of Margaret Farley's groundbreaking work, Just Love, that still speaks to students and resonates with them. How do we get the magisterium to listen? The first thing we have to do is get the magisterium to understand that they need to learn something. And I don't know how we begin to do that. I'm hopeful. Well, listen, no, not. I want to trust that the synodal process, if it continues, can lead to that. But I have to honestly say to you that I'm disappointed in what the synodal process has wrought so far. I really am. I think that there are so many people, many in this room, who entered that process who swallowed their fears that we're being set up. And we entered into it and we spoke our minds, we spoke our hearts, we spoke our pain, we spoke our traumas, and they got some voice. But the more the process went on, the more muted that voice, that pain, that trauma became. And the fear was we can't let that become too well known because it might split the church. And so I think if the synodal process doesn't lead us to a real deeper engagement with the need to learn, and that bishops need to learn, because I think one of the problems we have is that most bishops don't have a clue about the theology that's existed for the past 40 years. Seriously, they don't know. I would say and I would also point out that the American bishops are the worst. No, I say that sincerely, and let me give you an anecdote to show that. I was in the Philippines in the last March, March of 2024, and I was invited to be an observer for their national synodal gathering. Notice they had a national synodal gathering. We didn't have one here in this country. But this poor third world country, had a national synodal gathering, gathered people from all over the Philippines together for a whole day, fed them, they danced, they prayed. The Cardinal Ambo, the other cardinal, Philippine cardinal that I was kind of hoping for, he gave this beautiful address in the beginning where he talked about, this synodal gathering means that every voice is welcome, all opinions are welcome. They had a special breakout session for the LGBTQ section where they gave the rules were you were to give privileged voice to LGBTQ members. They deliberately made sure that there are trans people that were invited, that were attended. They had a special section on women in the church. They invited a female Episcopal priest to be present as an observer, who later got up there in the open mic section and said, "This is the most hopeful thing I've seen in the Catholic Church ever." I went up to this cardinal and I said, "Can I take you back to the United States with me?" And he said, "Is this still on live stream?" Yeah, okay. He said, "Oh, yes, I met the president of your conference. He has issues, doesn't he?" I say that to say that even in Africa, I have spoken to more Catholic bishops who want to learn more and have gotten a greater welcome even in Africa on these issues than I've ever experienced from our episcopate here in the United States. And so part of what I would think is a worldwide group to work with the GNRC, the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, and to work with bishops and not to hold the church hostage to what's going on here. I really believe that. Because I think as I travel the world, I see more openness and willingness to admit that they want to learn than I experience here. Not to say that doesn't exist here, but it's not yet a critical mass. So that's what I would do.
Thank you. And Annie?
Hi, I'll try to be quick. So I wanted to kind of go back to you were talking about unity and this, who is paying the price for church unity, and I just really wanted to say that's the part that resonated with me the most. That's something when I think about particularly women's roles and women's calling of how many women's vocations are we sacrificing on the altar of unity here in this synodal process. But another thing that really sticks with me about unity is when I think about, you mentioned that you are not optimistic that we would reach some kind of change without there being schism, that we shouldn't think of ourselves as a magical exception. And what frightens me about that most is that I served for 2 years in the Pacific Islands in the Federated States of Micronesia. And when I think about, okay, if this schism does happen, where is this church going here? And the things that would happen, particularly to women and to young girls, should churches in some parts of the world just sort of go their own way, rather than being somewhat tied to Rome. That's what frightens me about this potential of schism. And I was kind of wondering if that is something that you think about, or does that frighten you as well? Would that schism alleviate marginalization in some places for some people, but intensify it elsewhere?
Thank you. That's a really great question. I have to admit that my experience is very colored and affected by the U.S. American experience. In the longer paper where I talk about unity, I point out that previously, the last time we had major splits in Christianity like we're experiencing now was in the 19th century over the issue of slavery. That's when the Baptists split, the Methodists split, the Presbyterians split, and the Catholics didn't. And the reason why the Catholics didn't split over the question of slavery is because we basically said it wasn't a religious or moral issue. And we absented, and no, seriously, and we absented ourselves from the conversation. And so we preserved unity, but at what price? Now, what you're saying is important, and that is, what would a schism in an institution as large and as global as the Catholic Church look like? How would it affect populations such as in Micronesia and other places? And the question is, I don't know. And I think I would answer the question this way. When we look at schism, we're talking about a negative reality. We're talking about a split in unity. Whereas in my mind, I'm thinking that what we really need are new forms of religious life and religious faith. We need new forms of religious community. And so we need to create new kinds of religious affiliation where we have the institutional support for a faith that recognizes the equal human dignity of women and the equal human dignity of persons of color and the equal human dignity of LGBTQ plus persons, where we have a faith that really does believe that when we say that all are created in the image of God, that all means all. And if we create that kind of form of religious life, then there will be a religious place of shelter and refuge and advocacy so that women and children would not be living in vulnerable situations, or at least there would be a religious advocate for them. So maybe it won't be the Catholic Church as we know it. But I really think that in my mind, and my dream, and my hope, is that I don't look upon schism as being a thing that says the tearing down of this, but I think of it as a stepping stone to the creation of new forms of religious life and belief and affiliation and belonging. And that church would be the advocacy, the refuge place for folks who are living in vulnerable situations. Because yeah, right now, our church, there are people who are, even in other places, and again, I can only speak to what I know best, in Africa that are really, really hurting. In Uganda right now, the persecution of LGBTQ people is orchestrated and led by Catholic priests and bishops. Catholic politicians, Catholic priests, out people publicly from the altar and stand by as they're beaten or driven from their homes or imprisoned. So I'm not saying that there's a simple answer, but my dream answer is that we need to create new forms of religious faith. And I dare to believe that Dignity and other queer-inspired places, that we can be the seeds of what that new religious community might look like. That's the best answer I can give right now, but thank you. I really appreciate that. We have one question that keeps on raising his hand forever, and then we'll be done, okay?
Poll. I've been particularly inspired by what you've said in the last 3 or 5 questions. The conversations I have heard is that in Africa, having a male lover is a problem. If you've got having a male lover or a male person, will get you outed in church and killed. But having 3, 6 wives, if you can afford them, that's no problem, and everybody looks, behind themselves. Is sort of a trade of, well, if Africans accept homosexuality and North Americans and Europeans accept the concept of multiple wives, we've sort of given each party what they want. I mean, if the church is supposed to be for everyone and from everyone, why can't it be more open? I mean, you've got experience there, which I do not. Is that the sort of thing, are there open-minded people sufficient that they could see that kind of world in front of them?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is that I would hope that the conversation doesn't get to a set of trade-offs, okay? We'll give the North Americans and Europeans LGBTQ stuff, you give us polygamy or whatever. That's not the way we should look at this. We need to look at this from an ethical perspective. As a moral theologian, I would say this, that our sexual ethics should be at the service of what advances the human flourishing of human individuals. That's the fundamental question. Now, I think that what we're going to discover is that it's going to be hard to give a single answer that fits everywhere around the world, because one of the things with the face that we haven't done adequately is that human sexuality is profoundly incarnated and enculturated. Even our understandings of masculinity and femininity are very culturally encoded. And I think one of the things that churches try to do is to give an answer that applies everywhere, all the time, and will never change. Well, I think we got to get out of that kind of situation, first of all. But I think we ask the question, what behaviors advance the flourishing of individuals, both as individuals and as communities, and what behaviors denigrate human beings and human communities? I think that answering that question is a more helpful way of looking at it than saying, okay, we'll give you guys polygamy and we'll give us LGBTQ issues. No, the question is, what advances the well-being and the dignity of human beings? And once we begin to phrase the question that way, instead of who can do what with whom under what situations and circumstances, in other words, we need to change our position from looking at the morality of sexual acts to asking, what is authentic and life-serving sexuality? That's the question we need to start asking. And when we start asking that question, then we'll find our way to a better way of dealing with these questions of sexuality, no matter where they arise and how they arise. So that's the way I would get out of it. In terms of like, give us this, give us that. Because, okay, there's still LGBTQ persons in Africa, and we're not going to be so well served even if you allow for heterosexual polygamy. And we can't just simply say, well, you're in Africa, tough. No. And so I think the church has got to ask better questions. If we start asking better questions, then we'll have a more adequate approach. So thanks. Wow, you guys are great. I wish I could bottle you and take you back to Fordham. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been a joy being with you. Thank you.
And thank you, Bryan, for leading us into an experience where we can be really honest about what is happening in our country, in our world, in our church, in our hearts, what the goals need to be, and where we can engage with everyone. I really appreciate folks' commitment to this kind of space and question. I do want to give a quick shout out to Tom and Peter in the back who have struggled to make sure that we could do this. Thank you, tech support, thank you so much. And, you know, a number of questions came up about sexual ethics and how that plays into and connects with all that, everything else that's going on. I would love to direct folks to Dignity USA's Sexual Ethics Task Report, Experience, Strength, and Hope, I believe is the name. It is accessible on our website under Historical Documents. And know that this is a dated document. There are lots of, it was pre-AIDS, it was the visibility of the transgender community. There's work to be done there. But there is a section where it talks about the values and the ethics, and it has, I believe, 7 characteristics of what ethical sexual relationships contain. And I also find them as really helpful for talking about what ethical faith life looks like. So it's...
I have my students read it, yeah. It's still, it's amazing that, yes, it is dated and it's pre-trans visibility, it doesn't speak of non-binary realities and things like that. But for its time, and still, and not only that, but when we go through the values in class, I can see my heterosexual students like ticking off in the box, oh. I'm like, outing yourself. But anyway, but no, it's a really good tool that I think that still merits a lot of respect.
Framework, but and please take care of yourselves in these times in finding the dream that gives you the new hope and that helps you break the old stereotypes. Find a community, spiritual or otherwise, that is sustaining, that is affirming, that is supporting, that helps you become who it is you are. If that is a Dignity community, we would love to continue to welcome you or welcome you for the first time. If it's a woman church community, if it, whatever it is so important to be in community at this time of division and isolation. So thank you for bringing us all of that tonight, Bryan. Thank you all for being here and for being part of this very, very important conversation. Thank you and good night.